Hundreds of thousands fill the center of Buenos Aires to voice their anger at Argentina's President Cristina Kirchner. But what exactly do they want? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. It was Argentina's largest anti-government demonstration in years. An estimated 700,000 people flooded the capital and other major cities on Thursday to protest against the policies of President Cristina Kirchner. Their grievances include violent crime, inflation and alleged corruption, concerns which have seen the president's approval rating plummet just a year after she easily won her bid for re-election. But Cristina Kirchner and her supporters say the protests are being organized by the wealthy elite and encouraged by a vociferous right-wing media. They also point to the country's emphatic economic recovery after collapse in 2001 as proof that the country is in safe hands. And while the current president inspires resentment amongst some sections of the population, there is little support for any of Argentina's fractured opposition groups. A recent poll said 65% of Argentinians disapproved of the president's opponents. Adam Rainey reports from Buenos Aires.
The movement is largely a middle-class one, but thousands of people who've come out here to the center of Buenos Aires have a variety of concerns. They say they're upset over inflation. Many say they're upset over the economy, which has slowed down incredibly since its highs a few years ago. They also say they're concerned the president really at heart wants to push through a constitutional reform to run for re-election in 2015. They also say they're concerned over crime. So it's all these issues that are at the heart of this movement. The people who organized this protest, though, say it's a leaderless movement. There weren't any speeches here, but people who came out said they're upset over several things.
Because of the insecurity, they promised us a lot of things but haven't delivered. There is a lot of corruption.
Every day, the country is worse off. There's not a serious economic team. They take self-destructive measures. Everything is moving backwards due to this inept government.
I'm not from the oligarchy. What I want is security for my children and grandchildren and to live in peace.
The president has shown no interest in creating a dialogue with this group, though. She's made many combative statements, saying if people want to come out and protest against what they've done to improve human rights, come out and do so. If people want to come out and protest against how they've helped poor people because these same people really just want to pay them very little money to do odd jobs, then come out and protest. So the government isn't showing much interest in listening or taking on board what many of these people here have to say. And also the people themselves, despite complaining a lot about what the government's doing, you're not hearing a lot of alternative ideas about what it should do instead. How else it should rein in debt and pay off international creditors instead of keeping people from buying dollars. How else it should deal with the faltering economy. So you're hearing a lot of complaints, but you're not hearing a lot of alternatives. But at heart, people are angry, upset, and they want to change, and they want it soon.
So what's driving the protests in Argentina? With me to discuss this, Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research here in Washington, D.C. Next to him, Peter Romero, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere Bureau at the State Department. And from Buenos Aires, independent journalist and commentator Francesca Ferrantini. Francesca, first of all, then, I mean, it was quite a turnout in Buenos Aires and elsewhere. How much of a challenge is this? How does this even compare to the protests we saw in 2001?
Well, I think actually making that comparison is a little bit ironic because those protests in 2001 were much more based in popular movements that had been coming throughout the 90s about neoliberal economic policies that had been most affecting poor and working class folks. This, on the other hand, is much more being driven by a middle to even middle upper class, and I wouldn't even call it a base of people, but definitely groups of Argentines. There were numbers that the official number was 100,000. The numbers of the opposition were 700,000. I think it's somewhere in the middle. But I think that it shouldn't be put in the same setting as 2001, also because of the grave economic crisis that Argentina was facing at that moment, that compared to now is really has very little relationship to what's going on the ground here.
Is this some spontaneous uprising? I think in that report we just saw someone said it was a leaderless uprising, but how well organized is this?
Well, so it was mostly organized via Facebook and social media, but also it's important to note that it was supported by major right-leaning opposition parties, as much as the government denies that there were people genuinely coming out that weren't allied with any political party. They are right in saying that it was supported by the major opposition parties. The interesting part about that, actually, though, is when you were on the streets looking around, there were no party flags, there were no representatives, politicians from any of those opposition groups. Instead, it appeared to be autonomously organized, when actually it was fairly heavily backed by some of these right-leaning parties.
All right, well, let's go through some of the grievances in a little bit more detail. The protesters are unhappy that President Kirchner brought in restrictions on buying US dollars. The government says this was to prevent tax evasion and capital leaving the country. People wanting to exchange Argentine pesos for dollars now have to explain what they will be doing with the money. That's one of the restrictions. Many Argentinians want dollars to protect themselves from high inflation, which the government says has reached 10%. Some private economists say it may be at least twice that high. The protesters say they're also fearful of crime. And some fear Kirchner may want to amend the country's constitution to abolish presidential term limits, something that she denies. Ambassador Peter Romero, it's quite a long and varied list, actually, of grievances. Do you feel this is something coherent, something we're seeing now coalescing that might be a real threat to Cristina Kirchner?
Well, Shihab, it's hard to tell at this point. It's something that's starting. I was struck with a couple of things, though. And that is that the people who came out didn't seem to be tools of capitalist agents or the wealthy or whatever. When you scan the people in the square throughout Argentina, not just in the capital, they were just common Argentines. And they're out there protesting these things that we mentioned in terms of inflation and high crime rates and that sort of thing. But the thing that impacted me more than anything is their chant of "We are not afraid." That, to me, is something that you would expect to hear from the streets in Iran or in Moscow. But to hear that in Buenos Aires, to me, was very telling, because I think that it shows that people are fed up with the strong-armed politics of President Cristina de Kirchner.
What do you mean by strong-armed politics?
Well, it's kind of Chavez light thus far. I refer to the Venezuelan president, and that is that you intimidate your allies. For example, how dare you? She's raised indignation, which is kind of an Argentine characteristic, to an art form. And for example, how dare you criticize or even challenge the numbers on inflation and other numbers, macroeconomic numbers that the government publishes and puts out. Not only that, but has made it a crime to challenge those. She has threatened and deployed teams of tax collectors to offices, particularly in the media, that criticize or potentially criticize government. And that sort of thing results in self-censorship. So there is a current here of strong-arm politics, but I think probably the thing that galls many Argentines most is the fact that she doesn't listen. Any challenge or anything that doesn't comport with the policy is considered a challenge and not worth listening to.
There's quite a few assertions there. Mark Weisbrot, what do you make of that? Chavez light.
Well, I don't see any intimidation there. I mean, look at the Argentine press. It's overwhelmingly against the government. In fact, that's part of what this whole battle is about. It's they're trying to regulate the media, and kind of like we regulate the media here.
Actually, I can go into some of that. Actually,
yeah,
because there's a new media law. We have a graphic which might help explain some of this, which is quite important. There's a new media law which comes into effect in December. Supporters say the law will encourage diversity in the country's media industry. Critics, however, say it's designed to diminish the influence of President Kirchner's critics. In particular, the country's biggest media conglomerate, Grupo Clarín, would have to sell some of its key assets, particularly its non-print holdings, including some of its TV stations. And Clarín is challenging the constitutionality of that law, although it's already been upheld by the Supreme Court in May. Mark, I mean, what do you make of the criticism of that? It's sort of what the ambassador here is talking about. This is some way to intimidate the opposition.
No, I think it's not at all. I mean, look, if we had a media, we have right-wing media here too, but Fox News has maybe a couple million viewers, and we have talk radio is bigger. But the point is, it's not the overwhelming majority of the media that has a political agenda like the media in Argentina, which is monopolized to a large degree by the Clarín group. And so, yeah, we have ownership restrictions here too, by the way. We have limits on what, and they've been watered down over the years, and to me that's a very bad thing. So, yeah, they want to have some diversification. In fact, the UN Special Rapporteur and the media praised the new media law in Argentina, and they're actually pretty fussy about any. I mean,
on the face of it, it doesn't seem that draconian. Basically, it limits any company to 35% of market control. That seems quite high.
And Clarín has a lot more than that, especially in the subscription TV. So this is really, if we had a media like this here, and this goes not only for Argentina, but for Bolivia or Ecuador or almost all the countries that have left governments, we wouldn't have Obama as president. He wouldn't have won his first term because half the country would have believed he was a Muslim and wasn't born in the United States.
Francesca, did you recognize the picture of Argentina that Ambassador Romero was painting there?
I recognized it because I was actually on the streets, and so I saw it. But I do think that it's important to understand that a year ago these protests were not happening. And why is that? And I think that one thing that has been in the background, I mean, some people have been able to articulate it, is this restriction on dollars, right? And the fact is that those restrictions are affecting only 11% of the Argentine population that is able to buy a house, buy a car, save. All of those things are happening in dollars. That doesn't mean they don't have a right to do that. It's a shame that more Argentines cannot save. And they do not save in their local currency because there is such high inflation. So I think there are some legitimate criticisms here. But I also think that in terms of all these different provinces where people came out, they're not representative of actually broad Argentine society. In fact, they're more representative of that 11% that feels like they are being directly targeted by the government. And ironically, the entire restrictions on dollars comes from the government paying two very large bond debts totaling of $5.5 billion in their national reserves in dollars. So they no longer have those dollars to then put into the economy to stabilize the peso. It's a little bit complicated, but really the ultimate reason that these restrictions came so suddenly were because there were these debts that were running out in terms of the timeline to pay them.
Actually, Mark, it might not be a bad idea.
The other thing I just wanted to say about the media.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in about the media because I really think that it's a shame that this protest was billed as 8N, right? The 8th of November. And that is specifically speaking back to 7D, which is the 7th of December, which is the date that the Supreme Court had set out to be the date that the new telecommunications law would be enacted. After all of Clarin's injunctions that it filed against the government, that this was the date that if you do not comply by the law, which by the way was passed 3 years ago, that fines will be incurred, that there could be then court action. And so the fact that this march was framed as a sort of counter-democratization of the media law, or of counter to this media law, I think was a big shame because it really does demonstrate that there are powerful forces that are supporting these kinds of opposition marches, like the Clarín group.
Ambassador, actually, you better respond to that. And this doesn't seem to be then a broad-based opposition movement, but as some have suggested, tied not only to the struggles of Clarín group, but the struggles of people who've never been terribly happy about any of the changes in Latin America for some time.
Well, I think I would beg to differ with Mark, and I would go back to the early years of Chavez. Everybody said, oh, well, this little adjustment to the media law in Venezuela, it's not such a bad thing, it'll open it up. Well, where are we today? Where are we today with media in Venezuela? There really is no independent
opposition is overwhelmingly in charge of the media, at least has the most
What
access.
media there is, I mean, it's a very small sector of what happens, what news Venezuelans get. The radio is down to basically 3 independent stations.
Right.
There's 1 cable independent station.
That's not true at all. The overwhelming, like you said, the overwhelming majority of the media is controlled by private hands, and there are people who are against the government. And in fact, the state TV, which is their biggest thing, has about 5% market share.
Well, let's move on from Venezuela. Let's stick to Argentina for a little while. Actually, this isn't a bad time, though, Mark. Just to
can we just talk?
Get some economic context, though. You know, why the last? I mean, since 2000, then. I mean, certainly many of the international headlines suggest, you know, I mean, well, Argentina has been on some sort of pariah economy. It isn't allowed, frankly, to borrow on the international markets.
That's right, and that's why they need the foreign exchange controls.
So that explains why, exactly. But give us that plot of history. What happened in 2000? What sort of reforms happened since then?
Well, I think this is very important because you don't get this a lot here because the business press, since the default, has been kind of hostile to Argentina internationally. But the true story, and again, these are just facts, you know, that are not in dispute, is that the Argentine economy has been one of the most successful in the hemisphere during the Kirchners. You know, they had 9 out of the last 10 years. And it's
what sort of growth rates are we talking?
Growth is, you know, again, this is not using the government's inflation rate, but using the the lower estimate, about 85%, one of the highest in the region.
Over that entire period?
Yeah, right. Over the entire period, but it's huge. They reduced poverty, again, not using the government's inflation estimate. They reduced poverty by 2/3 and extreme poverty by more than 70%. The inequality has declined from, if you look at the 95th percentile near the top to the 5th percentile, the ratio has declined from 32 to 17. They achieved record levels of employment by 2010. So the economy is slowing now, and I'm sure that's probably part of the reason you have protests. But this has been extremely successful, and you wouldn't really know that from most of the press. The press focuses on inflation, and it takes advantage of...
Are they telling the truth about inflation?
Well, no, I actually think the government numbers on inflation are probably wrong.
That's rather problematic,
but it's not necessarily the private estimates are right either. I mean, you know, we don't know exactly what it is, but it doesn't really change the story because what matters is people's real income, okay? And so you can use the independent estimates of inflation, and you still get a vast increase in real income for people. And you have also these programs, you know, the universal allocation per child, which is huge. It's bigger than the one in Brazil or Mexico. That's why Cristina won by such a huge majority. Now, she's had trouble before when she had the big fight with the agro industry, and her approval ratings fell then. And I think that, you know, she'll come back from this.
Ambassador Romero, do you dispute any of that?
Can I just jump in here?
I do. I think he left out some very important
Francesca, we'll get back to you in just a second, but Ambassador, just very quickly.
Just look at the Latin American Press Association and their criticism of press freedoms in Latin America, and you'll see.
All right, but as far as the economics,
what Marcus said is right. The economics have been good, largely based on commodity sales, above all soy. That is going down. The price has gone down. Demand has gone down as the Chinese economy has contracted.
But you accept that she was right, or
she has been,
was right to throw the IMF out?
But the problems are going to mount now, is what I'm saying.
Francesca, sorry. Francesca, can you hear us?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. No, I wanted to jump in because I feel like this speaks to some of the contradictions of this government and some of the legitimate criticisms that unfortunately were not present yesterday. Yesterday, I heard a lot of people saying, I pay my taxes, I don't want them to go to support bums, basically. And in terms of bums, it's referring to people who are on government programs that were not available in, let's say, 10 years ago, people who collect welfare and things like that. But in terms of this, some legitimate criticisms are that, yes, in the past 10 years, Argentina has experienced incredible growth, as was mentioned, basically because of the soy boom. However much that then growth has been put back into the economy to have some real actual industry and real, let's say, mechanization of the soy industry or putting some of the refineries in Argentine hands, that hasn't happened.
Right.
So we're still seeing most of that money actually leave Argentina, as well as in the mining industry. So there are criticisms, but they're coming from no one is actually discussing them. The media would never, the right-wing media would never discuss it, nor would the government discuss it, because that's where it's getting most of the money.
You've looked at the structural nature of the structural economy. I mean, does it need more diversification?
Yeah, no, actually, I'm sorry, but I have to clarify this for your audience, okay? You can look at the actual national income accounts and, again, the IMF or any other numbers you want to look at. Soybeans contributed, and soy export, you can count soy oil too. Of that growth between 2002 and 2008, which was the boom, contributed very, very little, 1 or 2% to that growth, okay? And exports, commodity exports as a whole, maybe 6%. I don't mean 6 percentage points of GDP, I mean 6% of the total growth, okay? So very little. Now, you're right that soy exports are important, but only because the foreign exchange to the government is important, because they can't borrow on foreign markets. But it was not a commodities boom. It was not driven by commodities.
So what was driving the boom?
It was consumption, investment, other exports. It was, but mostly investment in domestic consumption. It was a domestically driven, 88% of the growth, just as a matter of accounting, was domestic, okay? So that's just one of those myths that's repeated a lot. And again, that's not to say that it's not important or that they're not affected when commodity prices fall, but that's the foreign exchange problem. And that's why I said it's very important for the
government. We're running out of time. Ambassador Romero, it's
exchange.
clear that you don't like Cristina Kirchner's policies. What economic policy alternative would you offer them?
Very good question. I think if you look at Colombia, okay, Colombia is getting its law enforcement issues under control in terms of security. Its laws are transparent. The government is open. People, investors know what the rules of the game are. Not perfect, but will either surpass Argentina as the third largest economy in Latin America within the next couple of months.
What about income distribution, polarization between rich and poor? Equity?
Still a long way to go in terms of more equanimous income distribution. But I think that Argentina is going in the wrong direction. Certainly, you need to provide for the poorest of the poor. But that is only as good as how long your economy is sustainable. If you can't sustain it, okay, it's not a good model. And they can't sustain it in
I mean,
I
feel like it followed that model throughout the 90s. Aren't we talking about the model that it followed that led up to the crisis of 2001?
No, he's talking about the last 10 years.
No, I'm talking about the last 10 years.
And the 10 years, I mean, 10 years is a long time. I would call that sustainable.
Yeah. But I'm just saying that right now, when you basically dictate to bondholders, when you refuse to allow transparency in your economic affairs.
Is it dictating to bondholders, or is it what we call restructuring of?
Well, there was an ultimatum: you either accept it or get lost. I mean, that was the husband, Nestor, who basically said, you either take this or you get lost.
Right.
Okay. I mean, it was an ultimatum. It wasn't a negotiation. Okay. Right. Nowhere near a negotiation. But I think
this can't be understood though without looking at the history of Argentina and its bondholders and the debts that were incurred both by the military dictatorship but also by the Menem government of the 90s, right? Like, I think, and a lot of these bonds have actually been questioned in terms of their legality, in terms of under what conditions they were actually incurred and under what conditions the debts were incurred.
All I'm saying is that
I think that
affects the
Argentina's trepidation
market.
Right, but if
it affects the international market, if you do things with respect to price controls and export controls and that sort of thing, it sounds great domestically. It's great politics domestically. We're not paying back fat cat bankers and all those kinds of things. But the bottom line is, you got to go back to those fat cat bankers. You got to go back to the Paris Club, or else you're confined with borrowing from Iran and Venezuela at exorbitantly high interest rates.
I think that's really an oversimplification. Oh, that's a real oversimplification of things. I'm sorry. I think that. I think we're looking at a time with the BRIC countries and other countries that are arising, and including South America and Brazil and, yes, Venezuela. But I think that we're seeing new regional economic cooperation, and I think that's one reason why a lot of international business is scared, because they say, hey, we're going to be cut out of this deal. And I think that that's why Cristina Kirchner, although she shouldn't be, is thrown into the same bag as Chavez, which really her policies are not socialist at all. And she should not be thrown in that same bag. She's much more of a centrist government than most of the media would like to paint her as.
Mark Weisbrot, is this sustainable? We've only got about a minute left.
Yeah.
Do you see
well,
problems
I
ahead?
think both, Peter's right, but Francesca is also right. I mean, Peter's right that the international business...
10 seconds left, sorry, just be quick. Sorry.
Well, international business hasn't really liked what's happened, but they haven't been that important. The government has, and that's why I think Francesca is especially right. It hasn't been that important. They haven't had much foreign investment, and they haven't had foreign borrowing, and they've done better than almost anybody in the whole region.
Mark Weisbrot, Francesca Fiorentini, Ambassador Peter Romero, thank you all very much. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.